Okay, well, welcome to another Global Christian Perspectives, and hopefully we have a number of interesting topics to discuss this week. There's definitely a lot going on, and one of those we're going to start with is the issue about the morality of debt. As you've been following U.S. politics, we seem to be always threatening a shutdown or one way or another, and then they get solved with what's called a continuing resolution here, which is not the way the law is supposed to work. It's supposed to work by passing budgets and appropriations bills, but they've never seemed to get those done, so they end up putting everything in one big package. And included in this one, which is usually a whole bunch of stuff in there, but included in this one was a removal of the debt limit until, I believe, 2017 or sometime right after the election. So there would be no more fights over raising the debt limit. And in honor of that, evidently, the Treasury went out and borrowed $339 billion in one day. So we are currently in the United States up to over $18 trillion in debt. And by the time the debt limit comes back into being a factor, we'll probably be close to $20 billion in debt. Mm-hmm. And I think that raises a moral issue. We can talk about the financial aspects of it maybe at a different time. But I think there's a moral issue here, is because when governments borrow money, it's normally so that they can spend it on the current generation, but they're leaving the debt for future generations. And to me, that's very troubling. And so I was kind of wondering what your perspective is on intergenerational debt in terms of perspective of government. Chris, why don't you start from England? Do you have I don't know, what is the debt in England? Does England have a debt? Is it a major?
It's a significant debt, shall we say. And it's a sizable proportion of gross national product, which is worrying. And I quite take your point, Elgin, that we are going to be leaving the debt probably for our children or even our children's children to service. We have been servicing our parents' and grandparents' debts in our lifetime here. And it looks to be likely to go on more or less ad infinitum. It seems to be the way we have set up government finances. I don't think there's any easy answer to it, basically because the pain of creating a current account surplus for government would probably land us in a recession which would have exactly the opposite effects from that intended. So I don't see a way out of it, but I am bothered about the morality of it.
Alan.
Well, yes, I agree with that, and I think to myself, if we put this on a family level, how immoral it would be for me to die and my wife to die, and to leave our that's my phone. Sorry about that. And to leave our 4 children saddled with a whole bunch of debt, and how wrong that would be. Chris, Elgin would know this, but in American history, the only time that our government has not had a deficit has been during the Andrew Jackson administration, which was, I think, 1840, Elgin? Was it 1840? 1820?
No, it was a little before that. I think it was late 20s.
1820, yeah. So we have run a deficit almost every year since our founding. My feeling is, and here's my thought, I'll throw it out at you, is that democracies inherently foster deficit spending. Now, I'm not arguing against democracy. I happen to like democracy. But in order to get the people to elect our officials, we need to promise more than we can possibly deliver. And so we end up in deficit spending. So that's my thought. Now, what that means is, one more comment, what that means is I'm not so sure we're going to get a handle on deficit spending. spending.
Mm.
Yeah, I have a quote in my book. I think the name is Fraser. He wrote basically about the Athenian democracies, and he says democracies remain insolvent until people can figure out that they can vote themselves for money from the public largesse, at which point they become financially insolvent.
Yeah, right. Politicians are not going to get elected by saying, if you elect me, we're going to have to sacrifice votes. That just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Actually, our current government did somehow manage to get elected by saying more or less exactly that,
Okay.
which amazed me.
Yeah.
Going back to your point, Elgin, we did actually run a surplus for a while under Margaret Thatcher. I think analysis would show that that was largely on the back of huge windfalls from North Sea oil, but we did manage to do that. Unfortunately, as soon as the economy turned round slightly, it was found that that couldn't continue, and also she seized the opportunity of cutting taxes massively on the back of that. There are actually other aspects that I feel here. One is that we are busily using up the supplies of fossil fuels, which, if you like, is spending our children's legacy. And also, we are polluting the planet, which gives them a cleanup bill to face as well. So it's not just the debt, which is a feature of the bad morality of getting our kids to pay for things.
Well, in the United States, since World War II, we've only had two periods where we've run a surplus. One was basically an accounting mistake that resulted in a surplus in 1969.
Mm.
And then the other was at the end of the 20th century, where there was a deliberate effort to balance the budget, and it ended up being balanced quicker than they expected. But looking back on that now, we get the perspective of a large part of that was the internet bubble was just generating huge amounts of money, and when that internet bubble burst at the end of, or actually mid-2000, of course, that dried up and we went back into recession. I think you're going to get some debt no matter what, but the issue is how much are you compounding it? And I guess what's happening here in the United States is making it such an issue is the Bush administration and then now the Clinton the Obama administration have both doubled the debt that they received. So in other words, when George Bush left office, the big complaint you heard by Democrats was that he added more to the national debt than all the previous presidents before him. And that has now been, or will very, very quickly be, doubled by Obama. So he has actually added more debt than all previous presidents. So having a little bit of debt is one thing. Our debt is now exceeding our gross national product, and if we double it again in the next 8 years of the next president, whoever the next president is, I'm not sure the country could survive that.
Yeah.
Picking up on your point about oil, I don't share that point simply because we're finding oil faster than we can use it. So every year the known oil reserves actually grow. And as for cleaning up, at least here in America, that's not quite the same problem. We will definitely leave the planet. My generation will leave the planet cleaner, or at least America cleaner, than when we found it. If you look at America back in the 1950s and 60s, it was, we literally had lakes catching on fire from pollution. That just doesn't happen anymore. When I was a kid, Los Angeles would have they would grade the smog alerts, and you'd have lots of smog alerts every year. Stage 1 would be the highest. We now have virtually no Stage 1 alerts anymore, even though the amount of pollution required to trigger a Stage 1 alert has dropped dramatically. So it takes much less pollution in the air to trigger a Stage 1 alert, and we just don't have them as much. which isn't to say the planet is pristine, but it's definitely cleaner than when we received it. So
I've got to say, in terms of the trivial pollution, that's the case here too. In terms of CO2 in the atmosphere, however, we've left things an awful lot worse, and I know you don't agree with the contribution to global warming there, but if it is a major factor, we have stored up a really major problem for our kids.
Yeah, I agree. If. But rather than delve off into global warming, as tempting as that may be, in terms of the national debt, how are we going to get it? Are we just going to wait for it to explode and we become like Greece? Is there no hope?
Well, my question is, and I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination. It was funny this week. I was talking with a friend who finally said to me in conversation that if you want to be in a profession where you can be consistently wrong and never have to suffer the consequences, become a meteorologist or an economist.
Yes.
I'm a climatologist to that, but
yeah, I'm certainly not an economist. But what I keep thinking about is all the Western democracies that are in debt. And at one point, if that debt becomes unsustainable in all these Western democracies, what then happens? I don't know the answer to that. It's just a question I've had.
Countries can renege on their debts, which has happened in the past. That's feasible in principle, but the network of global trade would probably collapse if any large country did it at this point. You can always inflate your currency, which reduces the burden of the debt while hopefully what you're getting in increases because the money has become less valuable. Those are both techniques which have been used in the past. And of course, eventually, if you've got a permanently improving economy, if you can actually stabilize the debt and not keep borrowing more of it, you will eventually manage to make inroads into it. So there are ways, but certainly the reneging on debt one is not attractive.
No. I actually think what we're going to probably see is a spurt of inflation. On the other hand, politicians' ability to actually control that and make it work is not encouraging, and you're liable to end up like they did in Germany before World War II, where to buy a loaf of bread you had to take a basket or even a wheelbarrow of paper bills down to be able to afford it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, moving on to our next topic, the recent poll came out and showed that probably not too surprising that Americans are losing religion. And again, this is nothing new. I think Europe is well into this process, and we are now coming up behind, and seems like we're following after our European brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
So, A, do you agree with that? And B, what are some of the problems? Chris, you're much further along the path. Not you personally, but England is much further along the path than the United States.
England is definitely much further along the path. We have maybe 3% of the population attending church weekly, perhaps 5-ish will be once a month or so, and it only really goes up at Christmas and Easter to anything above that. We've only got about 50% of the population these days who, even on the, if forced to answer a question on what religion are you, will actually say Christian in some description. And problems? Well, I do find that I am considered very, very strange for going to church every week and to a Bible study every week. People think that I must be slightly deranged in my general circle. So it's maybe not as comfortable as it might be if you can generally assume that everybody is going to go to some church, which actually was the case when I was growing up. So yeah, we've got there first, I think, on that.
Alan?
Well, yeah, I agree with that, and I think I think for various reasons, secularism has had an impact. I think that we also have lost. And by the way, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. We've lost the nominal Christians who finally have lived out their nominalism and are not just connected to the church anymore or to a congregation. And I'll also say this, and I outline this in my book, The Politics of Witness, that we're seeing the demise of Christendom, and I'm okay with that, frankly. I think the sooner we kill Christendom, the better. And I don't think we have a stake in that. I don't think we have a stake in the state propping us up as a church. And so it's come down to the question or the issue of maybe as Moses says to the Israelites in the wilderness, who is on the Lord's side. Either you are or you aren't. That's just the way that it is. And so I am not concerned about a smaller church in the West, because I think it might actually be a more faithful church.
Yeah, could you give us a quick definition of, you say demise of Christendom.
Yeah,
how would you define Christendom?
Christendom is where the culture and the politics basically supports Christianity, commends Christianity, recognizes Christianity. It may not be an official religion like in the United States. There's no official religion, as there is perhaps in Germany with Lutheranism. But that in general, Christendom is the vestiges of Christianity as it has influenced the culture. And I just don't think Christians have a stake in that. I think that once Constantine in the 4th century decided to throw his lot behind Christianity, I think Christianity, frankly, suffered for that.
Yeah, it's an interesting view. I somewhat agree with it. In terms of a Christian, I agree with it. I mean, I'm much more comfortable with a small but faithful church than a large, apathetic church. On the other hand, I actually believe that Christianity is more than just a religion. It's what God wants us to do, and it's not because he flipped a coin and said, I think I'll have them do X or not X, but that it's actually the better for us. So I think that society based on Judeo-Christian values is going to be a better society than a society based on other values. So I guess I'm a little torn on that.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I would say to you is that the question for me is not whether or not the church will be political, it's how it will be political. And that's been my interest, is to how it will be political. So I don't want to get off on that. That's perhaps another subject we can discuss at another time. But it's not an issue of withdrawal. It's not an issue of the church saying we're not interested in what is going on in the culture and in the polity and the politics. But it's how we engage that is what is of importance to me.
Okay, I would pick up on your point about secularism, and I even as I wrote in my book Christianity and Secularism, I don't see secularism as a neutral movement. It is a hostile movement to at least to traditional religions. And now that secularism, again, not just secular, but secularism is the dominant philosophy / religion in the United States, clearly dominating the culture, I don't find it that surprising, because quite frankly, most people in a culture are just going to go wherever the culture goes. And if the culture...
On that I agree with you. On that I agree with you. Secularism is not neutral, and in fact, secularism puts itself in a neutral place in order to tell us as Christians how we should practice our faith. And
Yeah.
so I agree. Secularism is not neutral toward religion at all.
Chris, does secularism play a role there, or is it something different going on? Or do you disagree?
Well, the curious thing is that we have, at least nominally, an established church here. So government and the church have to be seen as, to some extent, in cahoots with each other. It doesn't tend to work much like that, though, in practice. I don't actually find that the generally secular run of politics is particularly hostile to Christianity, except when Christians take politicians to task for doing something which would have horrified Jesus, which is happening quite regularly, even from people in the Anglican Church, bishops, for instance, who one would expect to be more tied to the government. I like seeing them do that. We don't actually have an awful lot of serious antagonism from secularists towards Christianity that I see, even though we have managed to produce for our sins Richard Dawkins.
Actually, I wouldn't say that's even the biggest part of it. Chesterton wrote, it's not the overt arguments per se that will damage somebody. It's the underlying assumptions that go along with them. And I think the underlying assumptions of secularism, just going through the culture, going through society, is what they see on TV, is what they see in music, that's what they see on movies, is that God and religion at best don't matter, and when they do, they're mostly negative. And that's the, if you were to come, assuming life existed elsewhere in the universe, and you were to come here and you were to look at our culture and look at the TV, music, and what young people are going to see, you're going to conclude that religion doesn't matter, and when it does, it's negative. And so it's not surprising to see them pulling away from it. Would be, I guess, my point. Any closing comments before we go on to the next topic?
Well, I just raised some questions in my own mind about all of this, and I'm just not sure the church is in the crisis in the West that we think it is. I think that the gospel continues. I think that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and I think the Chicken Littles of the church speak too much, and I think it's the church concern, frankly, that since the 4th century we no longer have a dominant voice and we're no longer in power. But yet I see the gospel and I see Jesus Christ, who gave up himself to be a servant of all, and wondered if part of the problem has been when we Christians some time ago embraced power as the answer. And I'm not sure I'm just not sure that's the way of the gospel.
Well, I'm not in some respects concerned with the church for as much as it's dying in Europe and beginning to die in America, it's exploding elsewhere in the world. I think the church is actually overall quite healthy, and as you said, Alan, even within America, as the people who are only showing up because they're supposed to are not showing up any longer because they don't have to. Those who are showing up, are more committed, and it's easier to get the church to actually be the role and the function that it is. But okay, moving on to our last topic, at least in the first half hour, and we'll have to do this quick because we're running out of time. But we had an election on Tuesday, and surprise, the polls were wrong. The Kentucky governor that was supposed to lose by 6 points, thereabouts, 4 to 6 points, actually won by 9. And this isn't an aberration. We've seen this in the Canadian election. We saw it in the election in Israel. We saw it in a number of elections here. And evidently there's some elections in England where they had exactly the same. So it seems like the polls are consistent in that they're consistently wrong. The other half of the story is they have debates coming up on the Republican side, and a number of candidates are losing their positions or being tossed out altogether simply because of the polls. So do we rely too much on polls? And how, considering how much of public opinion is driven by the herd mentality of, well, the polls all say I'm supposed to think this, therefore do we have a problem here?
I think we have a distinct potential problem, particularly in that politicians pay an awful lot of attention to polls quite frequently in terms of what policies they will try to push for. And if those polls are not right, they are not going to be doing anything remotely like the electorate would prefer them to. And of course then you can only correct the position some years in the future. In our case, we have another 4.5 years of this government to run before we can correct anything it does. And yes, they are somewhat sensitive to what the polls are saying about things. I hope.
Alan?
Yes, we are poll obsessed, and I wish we weren't. And I really, really hope that the polls in reference to the Republican candidates are really wrong. Because to me, a viable election, I don't care whether it's the president or Congress or whatever it might be, a viable election really depends upon strong candidates from both parties or from all parties. And Donald Trump, and I say this carefully, but it is astounding to me that Donald Trump, who is a self-absorbed, narcissistic misogynist, can lead in the polls when the Republican Party has some viable candidates who could be competitive in the presidential election. I hope and pray that these polls are wrong, because I want two viable, serious candidates for president from the Democratic Party and from the Republican Party, and not these caricatures of themselves who are running for president. And I wish we would I wish we'd scrap polls. That's not going to happen. But the poll thing just really concerns me.
Yeah, it's to me it's an issue because maybe Donald Trump isn't even running. I mean, isn't even leading. If the polls are as wrong as they were in Kentucky, that could actually be the case. On the other hand, I think Donald Trump being in the lead is more of a symptomatic of a different problem instead of polls. Is the idea that we live in a media-obsessed culture, and where a significant portion of the population gets their news from comedy shows and comedians, and so it's not surprising that Donald Trump, who is probably the most media-savvy candidate, particularly since Ronald Reagan, but Ronald Reagan was an actor in movies, not really a master of television, and Donald Trump has spent 11 years in television. He's very comfortable in that medium. He knows how to tweak it, and I think that's probably another aspect of what's going on here. But any closing comments before we wrap this one up?
I'm not sure which of Trump or Carson would scare me most as the leader of the states, but those two being in front is deeply, deeply worrying to me.
What's just out of curiosity? We're learning a little over, but I'm truly curious. What concerns you about Carson?
He's made some, or is alleged to have made some comments which indicate that he would be even more hawkish than, for instance, Bushes 1 and 2, and I think that is exactly what is not needed at the moment.
So that's more of a policy issue as opposed to Trump would be more of a personality issue.
I don't have any idea what Trump might do. I think he's just too unpredictable.
And proudly so. All right, we're at the bottom of the hour, and we're going to take this time to introduce ourselves in a little more detail, give us a chance to let you know how you can get a hold of us. And again, my name's Elgin Hushbeck, and I am the author of several books. The one that I've been referencing, actually two that I've been referencing here, are Christianity and Secularism. And then the other one is Preserving Democracy, and you can get some of my views on the debt and the problems with government and preserving democracy, and some of my views on the problems with secularism and its conflict with Christianity in Christianity and Secularism. Chris.
I'm Chris Eyre. I'm one of Energian's editors. I blog at airlines, EYRE lines, .energian.net. And there isn't a book yet.
But one to come.
Oh, yes.
Alan.
Alan Bevere. I blog at alanbevere.com. That's Alan with 2 L's and 2 A's, and like Revere, but with a B. I am the pastor of the First United Methodist Church of Akron, Ohio. I'm a professional fellow in theology at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio. I'm an editor and author for Energian, and have written a book, The Politics of the Witness, The Character of the Church in the World, which both my liberal and conservative friends disagree with. So I have a sense of fulfillment in that.
Okay. Well, as we move into our in-depth portion, this week we're going to, following last week's discussion, Chris and I began an email exchange and decided to break it off and move it into here so that it's a little bit easier.
By the way, just to let you know, guys, when you lost me last week, it's because my computer just fell. So I didn't click out because I wasn't interested.
Knowing your history of connection, we kind of figured that was the.
Okay. All right.
But anyway, it was on the kind of the subject of a little bit of history and my view of economic history in particular. So, Chris, why don't you kind of introduce what your questions were, and we'll pick it up from there.
Well, what interested me is that your account of U.S. economic policy was so different from the one that I've generally had presented to me, which, for instance, held up the States getting out of the Great Recession as a wonderful example of spending your way out of a recession, which actually worked beautifully where other countries, such as my own, didn't manage things quite so well getting out of that recession. And I noticed that whereas I've seen several articles indicating that the US economy has done better under Democratic presidents since the war and worse under Republican ones, you seem to have exactly the opposite viewpoint. We're looking at different fact sets here, somehow or other, and I don't know whether there's a way of bringing those together. Unfortunately, I am not an economist, so I don't really have the expertise to examine the way the various economists work in full detail. So there we go.
Well, let me give you a little bit of some of the history I've already given you, so the audience can hear what I'm saying. In terms, one of the big differences, say in mine, is even though it lines up that way, it's it's not a political view of the economy. I don't look and say, well, it's a Democratic president, therefore it's going bad. And that starts off with the Great Recession. I'm actually in the late 20s, early in the 1930s. I'm critical of both Hoover and Roosevelt. And in terms of spending our way out of the recession, I mean, the typical view is that we had the stock market crash. Hoover didn't do anything. We went into the recession. Roosevelt comes in, and we spend our way out real quick, or we spend our way out. In actuality, we had the stock market crash, but Hoover was very interventionist in his role in the economy. The big difference between him and Roosevelt is that he didn't believe in payments directly to individuals, where Roosevelt did. But other than that, he was very active in the economy, and I believe killed the economy as it was trying to come out of recession, that and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. You go into Roosevelt. Roosevelt continued on with, he expanded those programs, but rather than things getting better, actually some of the worst years of the Depression were 1937, which was into Roosevelt's second term. And things continued to remain bad essentially up until World War II, where, from my point of view, government took its focus off trying to fix the economy, focused on the war, and since it wasn't paying attention to what the economy did so much, the economy was actually able to recover. So that's, I'm not looking at it. If you fast forward, for example, things were normally, if you look at the Bush years, the common criticism is Bush had this terrible economy, and then he it made it even worse and left it to Obama. I look at that and I say, well, we had the internet bubble, and the internet bubble burst literally in the summer of 2000, the election year before Bush was even elected. So, allowing for economic things to progress, yes, the early years of Bush were pretty bad economic times. And then we had the housing bubble, and that led to the problems under Obama. Surprisingly, though, I don't blame, if I was going to be partisan about it, I would blame aha. See, Clinton caused a big problem and left it to Bush. Strange thing is, I don't hear any Democrats saying Clinton caused a problem and left it to Bush, even though they will say Bush caused a problem and left it to Obama. You can make the same argument. I don't make either one. I don't think that either recession was a factor of the president. The internet, Clinton had no real responsibility for the internet bubble. Internet bubbles are bubbles. The same way I don't think Bush had a role in the housing bubble, and actually he did have one in the sense that he tried to prevent it but was blocked by the Democrats. But still, that's not my prime point, and I don't think the Democrats, I don't think the major problem we have right at the moment is even from the housing bubble. So that was kind of my view of economics. And when I don't look at, well, who's the president and what's the market doing right then. I try to look at what was actually the cause of the events. For example, rather than blaming Clinton for the bad times under Bush, I look at, well, what actually caused the problem, and that's where I come up to my different view of economics. Is in many respects, because I don't look at, oh, Roosevelt must be good, or Hoover must be good, Roosevelt must be bad. I try to look at underlying trends, and when I do that, that's where I come up with different views.
Right.
Let me bring around here. I agree with you, Elgin, that Clinton started the housing bubble. But Bush continued it. I still remember the speech in 2000, prior to 9/11, in which he talked about all the American houses and basically continued the policy of the government toward that. So I do blame Bush as well. Now, I also, I think you had said to Chris, that the whole housing bubble was started by the government, who basically fully banked but once the banks decided they can make quick money on this, they were glad to get involved. So to me, it's a concerted effort between government and in creating this problem that is going to crash.
I would point out, yeah, Bush wanted to continue the policy of home. He also tried to push for major reforms in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, both in 2003. He started warning about it in 2001. He pushed specific legislation in 2003, and then again in 2005. Both times he failed. By the way, he failed, Chris, because the Democrats were claiming that he was a racist and trying to deny housing to poor people.
Yeah, well, listen, you get on YouTube.
What's that?
If you get on YouTube, you can find a video of Bush administration arguing that we needed to do something and we're headed for a cliff. And Democrats in Congress basically rejecting that. In fact, one congressman talks about how upset he was that the Bush administration was wasting his time being there. So it is true that at one point the Bush administration said we're heading down the wrong path, and the Democrats in Congress did block that. And I'm with you on that. What I'm simply trying to say is that this started from both parties and also from government and from the private sector, and it led to the mess that we had.
Yeah. Well, I would also argue that that the housing crisis on itself would have been actually a small factor. It would have caused a small recession, if anything at all. What really was the problem was there was an accounting rule put in November of 2007 called mark-to-market, and we don't have time to get into all the details here, but shameless plug, Chapter 9 of Preserving Democracy goes through all the stuff in detail.
Yes.
But it actually was an accounting rule change that went into effect and began to roll out as companies began their fiscal year over 2008. And quite frankly, it was repealed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1937 because it was causing such harm. And I still can't figure out why anyone thought it was a great idea to bring it back into play, but it was really what caused the lockup of the markets, Lehman Brothers and things like this. That's why TARP didn't work. That's why the bailouts didn't work, and the economy continued to spiral down until literally the day that the Federal Reserve, the Accounting Board announced it was going to repeal that rule and go back to the previous rule. And you'll see, if you go look on the stock market charts, you'll see the end of March to the first couple of days of April, you'll see a tremendous spike in the market, which is why all the banks were able to pay all those loans back and things like that. So, again, this is where I look not so much to the politics, which often drives a lot of the political discussion. I look for what are the underlying economic factors. And again, I don't really blame the recession we're in now. I don't say, aha, well, the Democrats caused that. They played a big role in it, but it's more, I want to know the economic factors instead of the political factors.
I think I should sort of underline I have no dog in the fight as between Democrats and Republicans. Because if I had any reasonably left option, I wouldn't vote for either of them if they were parties here. What I'm looking at here is the underlying principle, which seems to be the case, that it is always right to cut government expenditure and not to run any deficit for any reason. It seems to me sensible rates, which emphatically our government is, and I believe yours as well, sensible rates, which emphatically our government is, and I believe yours as well, and there is a recession, then spending on particularly things like infrastructure, which will be a legacy for the future makes total sense. You are injecting money into the system. You're employing people who otherwise would be a drain on the system, and when employed, they pay taxes. Things start revolving. On the other hand, although I occasionally see governments not doing too bad a job spending their way out of recession, I very rarely see governments when times are tough do what is obviously the other sensible thing, which is curtailing government, because at those times the buoyant economy can absorb the shock of that. At the moment, you've got an awful lot of Europe, which is basically trying to do recession by austerity, which is reducing the amount of money in circulation and is making the economy worse, where frankly they should be not worrying about the deficit until later, because interest rates are at historically hugely low levels at present. From my own point of view, if we're in a recession and I have borrowing power and reasonable certainty of income in the future, and I can borrow very quickly, it makes perfect sense to me to go out and buy some things then, because I can buy them cheap, and it improves the economy a bit, and I'm able to do that. Whereas when things are flush, sticking some money in savings becomes sensible. And I see that as being sensible policy for governments as well. So my big point was on the Roosevelt thing that we had, where you seem to be criticising Roosevelt's spend on infrastructure, effectively.
Yeah. Well, I actually say there's there's what happened then, and there's where we are now. One of the things that's different about Roosevelt to now is he did spend a lot of money on infrastructure. We can look back historically and say whether it worked or not, but you look at they're still building. People are still using some of the buildings that were built during that period today. Some of the roads and things.
Yeah.
So there was building on infrastructure. Nowadays, because of government is so big, there's so much bureaucracy involved. As Obama said, shovel-ready jobs weren't quite as shovel-ready as he thought. It's virtually impossible to get anything going and built. You could not do what Roosevelt did today because of the permitting process. Give you an example. California is currently trying to build a high-speed train from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and so they're currently trying to build the section from, I think it's Fresno to Bakersfield, which is a middle section. They've spent over $450 million, and I can virtually guarantee you that train will never be built. They've not laid a single inch of track, and that train will never be built because they'll spend another 450, if not more, $1 billion. That's billion with a B, in basically lawyering and excuse me, I think that is $1 million. But anyway, let me take that back. I think it is $450 million. But they're going to spend that again and again in basically lawyers and studies that actually do nothing other than chop down a lot of trees for the paper that's going to be used in the printing. And that's where government is today. And I think one of the problems with Roosevelt wasn't so much he spent all this money on infrastructure. One of the problems was the rules changed from day to day to day. I mean, he literally would set commodity prices each morning over his morning tea. So as he's having tea, he would decide what the commodity price would be for that day. Now, if you're in that business, how do you make any long-term plans when the price from day to day is going to be whatever the whim of the president was that day? You can't. what's happening now, I think, we came out of the recession in 2009, and we've had very little economic growth. What growth we've had have come basically from the IT sector, Apple, companies like that, and from the explosion in fracking, which has driven gas prices down so low for us. Now, Obama doesn't really control the technology section much, and he's actually been actively trying to suppress the fracking stuff, but it's mostly done on private land, so he has very limited ability to control that. So we've almost grown in spite of his plans. On the other hand, you've got bills like Dodd-Frank, which is the banking bill. They're still writing regulations, and those regulations won't be finished until 2020. So how do you plan your business around regulations that haven't been written yet, and you don't know what they are? This is the uncertainty that's causing so much problem in our country right now. That's making it very difficult. They're passing out billions of dollars, trillions of dollars actually, in quantitative easing, and the banks are largely sitting on that money because they're afraid to loan it out because they don't want to get caught. So the stock market is doing wonderfully. Everybody else we've had declining incomes because there's not a stable market in which anything can work. So when government is at borrowing at and they owe 2, 10, maybe even 20% of the gross national product, that's one thing. Right now we're in excess of gross national product, and we're looking to double our debt in another 8 years. That's borrowing then is something completely different.
I don't think we're likely to massively exceed our gross national product too quickly, but we're certainly more in that kind of region than the States is. But I mean, I look at Obama's record in the States, and you say he came out of recession in 2009. We ended up with a broadly conservative government that was bent on austerity in 2005, and we managed ourselves a double-dip, almost a triple-dip recession. We've maybe been out of recession since 2012, perhaps. I think policies over in the States actually got you out 3 years before ours did. So,
does that argue he hasn't gotten us out? He's actually kept us in the sense that if you look at where the economy is growing, it's growing from oil and energy, and it's growing from technology, the two areas that he has the least impact over. One other aspect of this is, and probably a bigger difference between us is, whereas government spending a lot of money, that's trying to affect the demand, either through regulation or those. My view of the economy is much more of supply side. In other words, you try to affect the supply. It's why when I look at wages, one of the things I'm really interested in is how can we create jobs to affect the supply of workers so that there's a demand for workers, rather than a demand side, which is we want workers to be paid more, so we're going to impose a $15 minimum wage, which seems to be the current fad here in the States. And that's a completely different way of looking at things. I would argue that the Keynesian approach during the 1970s was a huge problem, where we ended up with what was called stagflation, where we had the idea of a stagnant economy and inflation simultaneously.
Yes. Not
Hello,
good.
you want to jump in here? I haven't heard much from you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I read your email exchange with Chris, Elgin, and I agree with Chris on those. When the economy is bad, when the economy is good, that's the time to say we need to save money, we need to cut spending. But who wants a politician who wants to talk about discipline and everybody's feeling good, And when the economy is bad, that's when you need to leverage your assets and do what you need to do. And this is true of the home as well as government. I mean, part of the problem, part of the big problem, as I see it, is special interest politics. And the problem with special interest politics is that special interest people have one issue that's so critical to them that they simply cannot see the larger picture. And so since special interest politics seems so intrinsic to our politics, we're not going to get rid of it. So it seems to me the only solution is to find special interest lobbyists and just poison them. And then we don't have the issue anymore.
Not exactly the Christian approach.
It's not the Christian approach, but boy, it sure made things easier, wouldn't it? And it's just very frustrating for those of us who think that there are issues, plural, that are important and that we need to consider, and not have to just sit there and focus on one single thing that drives the politics and drives the decision making.
Well, so the aspect of politics, passion will oftentimes beat numbers, because if you're passionate and you get out to the polls, and your neighbor doesn't really care that much, so it doesn't bother to vote, you will beat. Yeah. One other problem I would add is that I agree. We can argue about what we should do in a recession. What really is the problem is what happens when the good times flow. And unfortunately, in this country, that's almost the green light for the politicians to spend even more.
That's right.
You see that. I mean, I talk about. I don't know if you have this in England. I hope you don't. But we have something called baseline budgeting, where they figure out what the baseline for the budget is going to be for the next 10 years, and each year they build in increases and they build in inflation. So, and it's really easy to boost spending in those out years. But then when you get to the out years, year 2, year 3, year 4, if the current Congress in that year doesn't meet what the projection was supposed to be, it's called a cut. So the budget, the department you're working on, maybe they get $100, and they're projected to get 105, but you only give them 103. Well, in our domestic debates, that will be called a $2 cut, not a $3 increase. And that's where, when you hear like American politicians screaming about cuts to this budget or cuts to that budget, or even proudly proclaiming we cut the budget, right? They rarely ever get actually cut. They normally all they're doing is slowing down the rate of increase.
We also have the other aspect of skewing the figures going on at the moment, where our beloved government is talking about increases for people which are less than the rate of inflation, and saying we are pumping your money into this, and they're not even keeping pace with inflation. So it is an effective cut, but of course it's concealed. Yeah.
Politicians are the only people who can put 2 and 2 together and come up with 17. And that's the problem we have. They jimmy the math, whether we're in good times or bad times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. At least a lot of them do. I am somewhat contrarian. I think there are some good people in both parties up there. Unfortunately, they tend to go serve for a few years and then retire and go back to the real world. It's the ones who hang around forever that tend to be the real problem.
Well, who wants to, I mean, seriously, Elgin, who wants to go there and really do something and just be stymied? I mean, I at some point, and I've never been in politics, but at some point I'd say, I got better to do with my time than to deal with this nonsense.
Yep. Well, we're about out of time, so I don't think we solved the world's problems this week. But, in fact, I think we came away more depressed than otherwise. But anyway, join us next week for another Global Christian Perspective, and we'll have another week of news, and we'll have some more in-depth discussion on a particular issue that hopefully you'll find enjoyable and informative. Thank you for being with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Have a good week.